When my parents passed away, I returned to the house I'd spent my entire childhood in. A two-story Victorian that sat at the edge of town, surrounded by maple trees that creaked in the wind like old voices. I hadn't been back in almost 15 years, and when I opened the front door, I was struck by how much of my childhood still lingered there. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust, the same scent my mother used to fill the hallways with. My father's tools still hung neatly on the pegboard in the garage. Even the kitchen clock was ticking steadily, though no one had been there to wind it. It was comforting in one sense, and deeply unsettling in another, because as familiar as everything seemed, there was one part of that house I'd never known. The attic. It was always locked, always forbidden. When I was small, I used to ask my mother what was up there. She'd smile tightly and say, "Just old family things, sweetheart. Junk from before you were born." I remember once, when I was about 10, I found a hairpin and tried to pick the lock. My mother caught me halfway through and shouted in a voice I had never heard before. Her hands shook as she took the pin away, and her eyes filled with something I didn't recognize. Not anger, not fear, but something darker. After that, I never went near the attic again. The day after the funeral, as I was going through my mother's belongings, I found a small brass key wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of her jewelry box. It was old and cold to the touch. My heart sank. I already knew what it was for. That evening, when the sun had started to set and the house was bathed in that amber light that makes everything feel half alive, I stood under the attic door with the key in my hand. The silence of the house pressed against my ears. For a moment, I almost turned back. But curiosity, or maybe something else, pushed me forward. The lock clicked easily. The hinges groaned as the door opened, exhaling a gust of stale, cold air that smelled of wood rot and old paper. The wooden stairs creaked as I climbed. My flashlight beam swept across piles of boxes, old furniture, and a collection of covered frames leaning against the wall. But what drew my eye immediately was a rocking chair near the single window at the far end of the attic. It was positioned perfectly to face the window, and draped across it was a faded patchwork quilt that I recognized instantly. My grandmother's quilt. I had only ever seen it once before, in an old photograph of my mother as a little girl sitting in her lap. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I noticed something pinned to the wall nearby. Drawings, crayon drawings, yellowed and brittle. Dozens of them. At first, they looked like the innocent doodles of a child. A house, a son, a family. But the more I looked, the more wrong they felt. In every single drawing, there was a tall, faceless figure standing behind the family, sometimes in a doorway, sometimes near a window. And in the corner of one drawing, scrawled in a child's shaky handwriting, were the words, "She said she lives upstairs now." My flashlight flickered. The sound of the house seemed to shift, like the wood itself was breathing. I turned to go, but my foot brushed against something. A small envelope had fallen from behind one of the drawings. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single piece of paper, with a line that made my blood run cold. "If you ever open the attic, do not sit in the chair." I left the attic without looking back. I closed the door, locked it again, and slept on the couch that night with every light on. The next morning, I packed my things and left the house for good. That was 2 years ago. I sold the house to a young couple a few months later. They seemed happy, until last winter, when I saw the property listed for sale again. The ad said, "Charming old home. Needs minor restoration. Unexplained noises from attic." Now, whenever I drive through that town, I make sure not to look at the house. But sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see that attic window faintly glowing, the outline of a chair rocking slowly back and forth. When my father died, my mother asked me to help clean out the basement. It was packed floor to ceiling with old boxes, furniture, and the kind of dust that seemed older than time itself. We spent the entire day sorting through things, old clothes, tools, letters. And just as we were about to stop, she found it. A thick leather-bound photo album. Its spine cracked when she opened it, the smell of mildew heavy in the air. That was your grandfather's," she said almost reverently. "You probably don't want to see what's in there." That night, when everyone else had gone to bed, I took the album up to my room anyway. The first few pages were what I expected. Black and white portraits of relatives I'd never met. Weddings. Family picnics. But then, halfway through, the tone changed. The smiles disappeared. The backgrounds grew darker. The eyes harder to see. Some of the photos looked almost smudged, as if someone had tried to erase the faces. Then I came across something that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was a photograph of my grandfather standing beside another man. Same height, same build, even the same faint scar on his chin. For a second, I thought it was a double exposure, but the man beside him was smiling, while my grandfather wasn't. The expression was wrong. Too wide, too deliberate. The next morning, I showed the photo to my mother. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. She went pale, closed the album immediately, and whispered, "We don't talk about him. Ever." When I asked who he was, she said nothing more, only that he wasn't supposed to exist. That night, I heard something downstairs. The faint sound of paper rustling. I went down slowly, and there, on the kitchen table, sat the photo album. I hadn't brought it there. It was open to that same picture. My grandfather, and the man who looked just like him. Only this time, when I looked closer, there was something new. In the background, barely visible through the grain, was a third figure, standing in the shadows, watching. The next day, my mother claimed she had burned the album. She said it wasn't safe to keep things like that around. But weeks later, I began to notice things. In mirrors, in reflections. Sometimes, for just a second, I'd see another version of myself. Not a trick of light or fatigue. Someone standing just a little too still, smiling when I wasn't. It's been years since that day. I tell myself I'm imagining it, that the mind plays tricks when you stare at your own face too long. But every so often, when I look at old photos, I notice it again, a faint shadow just beside me, always slightly clearer than before. When my grandfather passed away, my family gathered at his farmhouse for the will reading. The house sat deep in the countryside, no neighbors for miles, surrounded by fields that seemed to hum at night. It had always been a strange place to me. My grandfather was kind but distant, and there were rules he enforced without explanation. The biggest one was simple. Never go into the basement. As a child, I thought it was because it was dangerous, maybe full of tools, nails, or something that could hurt me. But as I got older, I realized the fear in his voice wasn't for my safety. It was something else entirely. After he died, I was tasked with cataloging the property. Everyone else stayed upstairs sorting through papers while I moved from room to room, taking notes. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of that locked basement door. The key hung on a nail beside it, old and rusted. My hands shook as I reached for it. The door opened with a low groan, releasing a breath of air so cold it stung my lungs. The smell hit me first, metallic and damp, like rust and old water. I descended slowly, my flashlight cutting through the dark. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The basement wasn't filled with tools or storage. It was almost empty, except for a single metal frame bed in the center of the room, a wooden chair beside it, and chains bolted to the walls. The floor was stained in places, and in one corner sat a small box. Inside were old photographs, dozens of them. Each one showed the same woman, pale and thin, sitting on that same chair. Her eyes were dark hollows, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The last photo made me drop the box. It showed her standing, eyes wide open, staring straight at the camera. The caption on the back read, "She finally woke up." My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard breathing. Soft, steady, coming from the far corner of the room. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard it made my ears ring. Then I heard the faintest sound of chains sliding across the floor. I ran up the stairs, slammed the door, and locked it. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I heard footsteps coming from below. Slow, measured, dragging. In the morning, My cousin came downstairs, pale as death. She said she'd been woken in the night by someone whispering her name from under the floorboards. The family sold the house soon after, claiming it was too much to maintain. But sometimes, when I dream, I'm back in that basement, standing by that bed, the air heavy and cold, as a voice from the darkness says softly, "You shouldn't have let her out."